All is quiet on America's southern border, quieter than it's been in many decades. In December 2023, the busiest month for undocumented border crossings since the start of the 21st century, an estimated 300,000 migrants tried to cross the border into the United States, according to the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. In August of 2025, less than 2 years after that record high, the number was a mere 9,700, many of whom were intercepted over the course of their attempt. All in all, 2025 is on track to mark a 60-year low in crossings over the southern border, while the proportion of migrants that are apprehended is creeping towards all-time highs. For the Trump administration in Washington, D.C., it's a legacy-defining achievement, and one that took less than a year to accomplish after the start of Trump's second term. But as Republicans cheer for Trump's secure southern border and Democrats breathe a sigh of relief that the national discourse has moved elsewhere, much of the American public has missed the most important change of all. Since the start of Trump's second term, in January 2025, America's southern border has been transformed into a military zone. Already almost one-third of the 3,100-kilometer or nearly 2,000-mile-long border between the US and Mexico is under direct control of the US Department of Defense, patrolled not by Border Patrol agents or by drug enforcement units, but by American soldiers. By the time Trump's second term concludes, the US military intends to lock down the entire Mexican border, and right now, the US public either doesn't know or doesn't care. So as we begin today's episode, we're going to lay out a quick caveat about the subject matter in question. No matter what the nature of America's militarized border project might be, no matter the implications for the United States or the rest of the world, it is abundantly clear that America's new approach to its southern border has been supremely effective. Certainly, we'd expect that for both our American and our global audience, there's going to be some debate over whether the effectiveness of this program is a good or a bad thing, but the Trump administration's goal on its southern border is to make the number of overall border crossings go down. No matter what else, that has absolutely happened. In 2024, an average of 192,500 migrants attempted to cross the southern border, according to official statistics, but from February of 2025 until now, that number hasn't crossed above 15,000 in a month, even once. Now, of course, we'll grant that the second Trump administration isn't exactly known for its statistical responsibility. For example, this is an administration that fired the head of the National Bureau of Labor Statistics after the release of a weak jobs report and tried to nominate a replacement who even conservative economists warned, quite forcefully, was going to try cook the books. But when it comes to the influx of migrants on America's southern border, it appears that America's customs enforcement personnel are providing an accurate view of the situation. And as such, whatever Trump is doing on the border, it's clearly achieved his administration's intended result. Now, the program that the Trump administration has put into effect relies on a series of military installations called national defense areas. In essence, national defense areas are zones of uninhabited land along the border zone that are placed under military jurisdiction, enabling US troops to traverse that land at will, surveil the surrounding area, and intercept migrants who attempt to cross through that military-controlled territory. The program takes advantage of a pre-existing, legally defined strip of land known as the Roosevelt Reservation. Established back in 1907, it was initially intended as a buffer zone to protect public lands from cross-border smuggling. The rest was owned either by individual states, mostly the state of Texas, or by private citizens. Now, though, the Department of Defense has converted long stretches of the Roosevelt Reservation into military zones, with the clearly stated objective to convert more or even all of the land over the next few years. In some places, the military zone is only as wide as the original Roosevelt Reservation, although in practice, US troops might step off that 60-foot strip of land over the course of their patrol or interception duties. In other places, the national defense areas stretch back substantially deeper into US territory than just the Roosevelt Reservation. As of July, the US has seized control over 4 distinct stretches of the border zone, about 170 miles along the New Mexico border, 63 miles in Texas between the city of El Paso and the community of Fort Hancock, about 250 miles along the southernmost border region in Texas, and 32 miles in Arizona, outside the city of Yuma. In each case, that national defense area is then subordinated to a pre-established, relatively close military base, meaning that, in essence, rules that apply on those military bases also apply on this stretch of land. Remember that, because it's going to be important later. Between the 4 national defense areas that the United States has already established, just under 12,000 members of the US Armed Forces are currently deployed there, most of whom either patrol the area directly or support patrol operations through surveillance, logistics, and other functions. At their disposal, those troops leverage over 100 copies of an armored fighting vehicle known as the Striker, equipped with thermal and infrared imaging technology that's effective at detecting human heat signatures, even at significant distances. According to troops on the border, speaking to US media, those armored vehicles are not equipped with weapon systems. Troops also leverage dozens of helicopters and a handful of high-endurance drones, while the Marine Corps is working to add barbed wire in certain areas to deny migrants access. Backing up the troops on the border are thousands of Border Patrol agents and personnel from the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. The Border Patrol has conducted its own hiring surge with the intent to push several thousand additional agents toward the border zone as soon as possible. The US Air Force deploys area reconnaissance assets, including spy planes overhead, while the US Navy deploys warships in coastal waters to assist with the operations. Coordinating it all, US military leaders work out of a command center at a remote Army intelligence base in the Arizona mountains. Now, an extensive program, like America's national defense areas, doesn't just appear by accident, and in fact, it became clear within just a few days of Trump's second administration that these operations were a primary political objective. On the day he took office, Trump declared a national emergency along the southern border and ordered the Department of Defense to surge troops and resources to obtain, quote, complete operational control of the area. 2 days later, Trump had already dispatched 1,500 troops to the border zone to back up 2,500 soldiers who were already stationed there. By that day, the Border Patrol had already circulated a memo indicating that some 10,000 troops would eventually be sent southward and that the Department of Defense bases could be converted into, quote, holding facilities to detain migrants who would be apprehended over the course of an expanded patrol operation. For 10 days at the start of Trump's second term, the Department of Defense was only allowed to post on social media about its new Border Patrol mission, signaling the White House's clear dedication to the operations that were to come. As for the reasoning behind the new mission, the way it was carried out, and the reasoning for using the US military instead of simply strengthening the agencies already at work in the border zone, part of the answer was clearly a desire to move fast and produce results as quickly as possible. Hiring, training, and deploying thousands of new Border Patrol agents would take many months and probably involve many headaches. By contrast, US troops could get to the border zone quickly and didn't need to be recruited or given very much additional training. The US military could lock down the borders quickly, using all the resources at its disposal and bring an immediate drop in border crossings in order to deliver a policy victory to the White House. But asking why the US military was deployed at all isn't the same as asking why they stayed after the first few months where border agents couldn't yet fill the gap. A large part of the answer appears to be rooted in their deterrent value, where US soldiers and Marines are a far more formidable hurdle for migrants to try and overcome. In the eyes of migrants considering a border crossing, American troops are better armed, they're better trained, and they're more dangerous. They're able to see you coming a lot easier, and they're able to respond far quicker. Well-hidden crossing areas have largely been exposed. The routes that worked in 2024 don't work in 2025, and if a person takes the chance of crossing the border, they're far more likely to be apprehended than they would have been even a year or two ago. Add the realities of America's stepped-up deportation efforts, and trying to cross into the US is no longer a winning proposition for anyone but the most desperate or the most hell-bent on joining relatives or communities who've already made it across the border. Just as important, because these national defense areas are legally classified as an extension of US military bases, anyone who tries to cross through them is subject to all the laws that restrict movement of non-military individuals across military installations. Not only can they be detained by the US military directly, but they can face trespassing charges that carry significantly more severe penalties than they'd otherwise face. When migrants can be penalized for trespassing on a military base instead of just getting the minor slap on the wrist that comes with an undocumented border crossing, they're at risk of spending a far longer and a significantly worse time in US detention facilities before being shipped abroad. On the practical side, leveraging the US military has allowed the Trump administration to lock down the border more quickly and more efficiently than ever before. For one thing, the Department of Defense can leverage assets that civilian agencies just can't dream of, from elaborate intelligence gathering aircraft to heavy military equipment to a practically unlimited pool of funds. For another, the military can operate under a different set of rules and push its people harder. As Major General Scott Nauman, head of the operation, explained it to the Associated Press, quote, "We don't have a union, there's no limit on how many hours we can work in a day, how many shifts we can man." End quote. Mobility also matters, quoting again, "We can fly people into incredibly remote areas now that we see the cartels shifting." End quote. And although the Trump administration intends to eventually extend national defense areas across the entire southern border, even a partial designation allows the US military to leverage its personnel and take the strain off border enforcement units. That way, civilian border enforcement agencies can concentrate their personnel and resources into areas where the US military isn't yet deployed, while also benefiting from their manpower, logistical, and intelligence support whenever possible. By focusing on smaller stretches of the border, both the US military and American civilian agencies can pay closer attention to the lands they're charged with patrolling, devote greater resources to each interception, and apprehend migrants with exponentially greater efficiency. And then there's the reasoning behind classifying these national defense areas as an extension of US military bases. A little while ago we mentioned that you should remember that little detail for later, and the reason for that is because it allows the Trump administration to exploit a legal loophole. Ordinarily, the US military is bound by a law passed in 1878 called the Posse Comitatus Act, which expressly prohibits US troops from being engaged in any function of civilian law enforcement except in extreme circumstances. That's the same law that has led to legal battles over Trump's troop deployments into US cities and states run by his liberal opponents. But although the White House uses a different legal rationale to justify those deployments, it can dodge the question of posse comitatus along the southern border. The US military can't conduct law enforcement on US soil, but it can absolutely secure its own military bases, keeping out trespassers, preventing disturbances, and intervening in potential criminal acts that American troops or other people on bases might try to perpetrate. So, by claiming these parts of the southern border as national defense areas, and then by classifying national defense areas as extensions of pre-existing military bases, the US military creates its loophole. There, the military can conduct civilian law enforcement on US soil because that soil is technically a military base, and thus it's subject to all the special rules and exceptions that the military enjoys on any other base across the country. To be clear, the legality of that approach is far from a settled issue, but until it works its way through America's courts and is met with an unfavorable ruling, the Trump administration can operate in that gray area indefinitely. And next, we've got to get to the really big questions around Washington's new national defense areas. But before we do, we've got to ask another big question. Do you enjoy what we do here at Political Fronts? Do you want more episodes, more analysis, deeper insights into the stories that are shaping our world? Well, that's why we recently unveiled Front.co. Damn it! Our brand new website designed to provide you with exactly that. Our writers at Political Fronts and our sister channel War Fronts gather at Fronts.co to take a closer look at the political movements, the leaders, and the policies that define this moment in history. Every week, we release 2 exclusive video episodes that can't be found anywhere else, including our briefing room, a regular roundup of underreported stories that deserve your attention. Recently, we published an episode closely related to this one on the modern-day power of Mexico's cartels, as well as episodes on the breakaway state of Somaliland and the deep links between Myanmar's rebel factions and the world of organized crime. That was a weird one. Also on Fronts.co, we publish 2 expert articles each week, drawing on journalists and analysts who've chosen to share their insights with our audience and the wider world. You'll also gain access to our free twice-weekly newsletter, our brand new subreddit, r/FrontsCo, and inside access to behind-the-scenes content, unreleased episodes, new merch, and much more. The subscription is just $5 a month or $50 a year, and it helps us grow our free offerings here on YouTube and also over at War Fronts. So if you want to support this channel and get a ton of content in return, head to Fronts.co. There's a link in the description below. It's also just Fronts.co, so you can just type it in. It's easy. Now, as we zoom out from America's national defense areas, we've got to ask the obvious question. Why should anybody care? After all, the American voting public elected Trump. Trump promised to crack down on crossings at the southern border, and now he has accomplished precisely that. As of now, there haven't been any known catastrophes or scandals surrounding the operation. It all appears to be going as planned, and the results in the lowered rates of border crossings would seem to speak for themselves. So, why should anybody give a shit? Well, there's a few answers to that question, but we'd be wise to start by focusing on the Posse Comitatus Act for just a little bit longer. As we mentioned, the southern border is not the only place in America where the grey areas of Posse Comitatus have become relevant, or where the Trump administration is seeking to wiggle around in those grey areas and just see what it can get away with. The problem here is that disputes around legal grey areas and the constitutionality of the actions of the US government are addressed by US courts and ultimately the Supreme Court. But America's court systems are very busy, and they prefer to rely on precedent wherever possible. That is to say, if new issues come up, they'll take whatever legal conclusions have already been decided around a certain issue and try to apply those conclusions to a new situation if possible. Right now, the Trump administration is dealing with posse comitatus issues on two fronts: its deployment of National Guard troops to US cities and its deployment of the military across the southern border. One of those, the city deployments, is a very contentious issue, and one where there's a real chance that in the end the US legal system will ultimately rule against Trump and his administration. The other issue, however, is the southern border, and that's a winning issue for Trump, where he and his administration can point to a highly effective migrant interception program with a relative lack of blemishes. Not only that, but to the extent that the American public knows about these national defense areas, it doesn't really seem to care very much, making this an issue where Trump and his legal allies can operate quietly on largely favorable ground. But in a country where legal precedent takes center stage, whenever possible, there's a distinct chance that the Trump administration could try and settle posse comitatus issues favorably through disputes centered around its southern border operations, while structuring its legal cases and arguments in a way that would also hand Washington a victory on other posse comitatus issues. This would be a rather difficult needle to thread for the White House, but the open question remains: can Washington get legal approval for its operations on the southern border in a way that also gives legal cover through a handy new precedent to justify its operations across US cities? Domestically, there are a few other potential pitfalls to consider, and especially the inherent risks that come with the military operating in close proximity to civilians. Many of the operations on the US border take place on or near privately owned property where ranchers, hunters, trekkers, and other ordinary people risk wandering into zones under the jurisdiction of the US military. In the event where those people might be armed, the risk is even greater. After all, under the Trump administration's own legal logic, those people would be trespassing with firearms on a US military base, and in that circumstance, it should be no surprise if troops assume the worst. The areas are not clearly marked, and considering the disparity between what the US military can surveil at a given time and what ordinary citizens can perceive about their surroundings, it's likely that US troops would detect an intruder long before that intruder even knows that they could be at risk. The national defense areas also raise a series of questions around grazing and mining rights, access to public lands for recreational use, and tribal jurisdiction over their own recognized lands. And then there's the political questions around what might happen if the next US administration is made up of Democrats or perhaps made up of Republicans who would rather not continue this policy. As effective as this border arrangement has been, it could all go away with the stroke of a pen unless Trump and his allies take more extensive action to entrench it in place. The program also comes with real concerns for Mexico, where the nation's own newly elected president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has been working to walk the line between appeasing Trump on a range of issues and trying to keep the US from engaging in military action on Mexican soil. Trump and his allies have repeatedly floated the idea of direct military action against Mexico-based cartels, who they blame for the flow of narcotics into the US. On the surface, these national defense areas would seem as if they're an unrelated issue. Sure, they're military installations, but they're focused on dealing with the flow of migrants and overland narcotic smuggling into the US. In practice, however, that's only a clear delineation as long as the US doesn't seek to use those operations or those installations as a way to lay the groundwork for future operations. There's no way for Mexico to know whether America's sophisticated intelligence-gathering aircraft flying over the border zone are combing the ground below or are trying to peer deep into Mexico for as far as the range of their equipment will allow. When US troops load into helicopters and take off, there's no way for Mexico to know whether that helicopter will turn toward an area where migrants are about to attempt a border crossing, or whether it's carrying special operators to be inserted for an operation on Mexican soil. Frankly, if the Trump administration wanted to deploy, say, 10,000 troops into Mexican border towns to try and hunt down the cartels, it could very easily position those troops within striking range by formally deploying them in support of border operations before giving an order to turn their attention southward. Luckily for Mexico, it's not all that likely that on any given day US military assets will suddenly be targeting Mexican citizens on Mexican soil, but the potential is there, and the relationship between Mexico and the US couldn't help but be more strained as a result of that. Finally, there's the question of migrants themselves and what it means for them and Latin America if they can no longer gain entry into the United States. Sure, immigrants who do make it into the US are then rounded up and are generally detained and deported either to their home nations or to countries like Colombia or El Salvador that have agreed to accept the deported citizens of other countries. But there's also a much larger, practically invisible group of migrants who respond to the new situation on the US border in one of three ways. Some attempt to make it to the US border, often based on false premises or an inaccurate understanding of the situation there, before realizing the truth of things and deciding not to cross. Those migrants often end up stranded in Mexico, where many communities, and especially in the northern areas, are coming under greater and greater strain from a population of people who arrived under the assumption that they'd quickly move on. Other migrants have still been forced to leave their homes for any number of reasons, but now seek refuge in places like Colombia or the nations of Central America, where deportation is far less likely, but opportunity is scarce in comparison to what might have been available in the US. And finally, a subset of people who otherwise would have been migrants and whose conditions in their home nations made the idea of a harrowing and dangerous journey to America seem like a viable solution, and they instead have no choice but to remain. In those places, poverty, violence, repression, and exploitation are just as much of a threat as they've ever been. But the people who might have attempted to escape can no longer justify the risk of failure. Back in Washington, authorities have been consistent about their ultimate goal on the border: zero illegal crossings, 100% enforcement across the entire US border permanently. To achieve that goal, plans are already in motion to add more national defense areas on the border and expand the ones that already exist. As they grow, America's southern border will grow more fortified, it'll host even greater numbers of troops, and if the project progresses as Washington intends, then the southern border that exists in 2028 will be worlds away from the one that existed in 2024. Whether the American public approves? That's a great question, and it would be nice to have an answer. But if anything is clear right now, it's that the American public just doesn't particularly care. Thank you for watching.